right, so thank you for coming out today. I'm going to be doing a presentation on Stonewall. None of this is my original research, but the reason why I'm doing this is because, well, this is one of those subsections of history that we weren't really taught about. So if it's something you want to learn, you generally have to learn it on your own. And it's part of my Inclusive Excellence Level 2. So after I do this, hopefully I have fulfilled the requirements. So I will be starting in World War II and then going into the 50s, a little bit of the 60s, and then straight into Stonewall, which rounds out that decade. I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview so that you kind of understand the significance of the historical event and why it was so important. And I want you to know that this is a condensed version of LGBTQ plus history because there's a lot. And even for me to cover this in an hour is kind of pushing it, but I'm going to do my best. And I also want to put it out there that I'm going to be using the gay terminology to encompass the LGBTQ plus group for ease of talking points, because the whole purpose of this presentation is if you do not have a good base in gay history, you should be able to have some takeaways from it. Just know that gay people have been here since the beginning of time. All right, so I'm going to kick it off with the land acknowledgement. UW Green Bay's land acknowledgement. We at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original first people of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient, historical, and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nations communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Potawatomi Nation, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge-Munsee Band of the Mohican Nation, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. So, World War II, never forget, World War II in the 40s. Approximately 16 million Americans, male and female, served in the military during World War II. Women could join as nurses, WACs, or WAVES, and men were in all the other branches. Some of the factors that made you unfit for service in the military was being gay. So to get into the military, you had to take a psychiatric examination, and many people were very good at passing because, well, they were passing with their families, so they were able to fool the doctors. The term gay actually became widely accepted during World War II. At the start of World War II, homosexuality, as they called it, was treated as a crime. So if they found that you were gay or even suspected you of being gay, the Army would imprison you up to 5 years and the Navy up to 10. But after they started imprisoning all these people, they're like, wow, this is a huge waste of manpower. So they started going for dishonorable discharges, were also known as blue discharges. So what they would do is they changed their policy, and the military came to view homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder instead of a criminal one. But the policy was really unfair because they would discharge you even on rumor of being gay. So if they suspected you to be gay, they would pull you in, they would pressure you to name your friends, they would promise you not to tell any of your friends. Well, they told their friends, they hauled them in, their families were notified. This really ruined their employment prospects in the future because it went on your permanent record. At the end of World War II, gays ended up settling in bigger cities like New York, Chicago, LA, and San Francisco. But persecution of gays kept up in the military, and many were forced out through persecution practices. And this is a picture of some of the WASPs, which were the women air service pilots, and some of the Navy guys. So the 50s. In the 50s, the U.S. was in the middle of something you might have heard of called the Cold War, and that was with the Soviet Union. And the public essentially was fearful that there were communists amongst us here in the U.S. Some politicians, notably this guy, Joseph McCarthy, amped up this fear and went for purging gays from the government. In a speech that he made in Wheeling, Wyoming, he alleged that there were over 200 communists in government positions, and of that, he said 91 were homosexual. And at the time, Eisenhower, who was the president, kind of latched onto that, and they started going through their government employees and letting people go left and right. People were getting left out, anything from the movie industry to losing their jobs in government. There was concern over whether gays could be pressured to turn over valuable information over to the communists. Eventually, McCarthyism came to an end when people are like, this isn't cool, like what are your bases, what are your findings, where are you getting this information from? They found that his details and his data was actually manufactured. But unfortunately, no one took a stand similarly to the purging of gays. So gay people at that time didn't really stand up for themselves because they were kind of looked down upon, and so they hid in the closets, as you've probably heard that terminology, and didn't come out to speak up for themselves. In the 50s, the image was of the hardworking dad and the stay-at-home mom and the squeaky clean kids. So that's what most people in America during this era saw as the functional unit, and anything that kind of came across that was seen as trying to destroy the American dream. And during this time, that's when gays were thought to be recruiting kids, recruiting people into their ranks. They were saying that they were hanging out at night and, preying upon the weak to bring them into the gay lifestyle. This is also when subversive terminology came out, which was code for homosexuals. So in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association published its first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And homosexuality was listed in that manual as a sociopathic personality disorder. So in other words, gay people had a mental illness and it could be cured. So many psychiatrists at the time said homosexuality was treatable. So all these gay people were like, oh my God, finally I can be fixed. And that's also what the general public thought too. So many gays ended up in mental hospitals during this time. And some of the treatments were honestly barbaric. They included lobotomies and hysterectomies because they thought that was a cure for being gay. And one psychiatrist claimed widely that gay men became gay because of a domineering mother and an aloof father. And the public latched on to this view, and you still will see this in today's society. So on to the 60s. So the Compton cafeteria riots is like one of those hidden history things. This could have been the Stonewall. I should be talking about Compton cafeteria riots instead of Stonewall, but there's a reason why a lot of you have probably never heard of the Compton cafeteria riots, and I'll tell you why. The Compton cafeteria riots happened in August of 1966, and it was one of the first LGBT-related riots. It took place in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, and it was the start of transgender activism in San Francisco. Many people that frequented Compton's, which was a chain, by the way, that operated from the 40s to the 70s, happened to be people that were street workers, trans people, drag queens, homeless gay youth. They went to this particular location in the Tenderloin district. They had a sympathetic friend because the night manager happened to be a gay man, but then he passed in that spring, and the company ordered in some Pinkerton guards, and they started changing things up. They said, we don't want you here, move along. If you were drinking your coffee too long, they'd call the cops in to harass you. One day, one of the drag queens had enough. The cop grabbed her arm, and she was like, get off me, and she threw her hot cup of coffee right in his face. And that was kind of a signal to everybody else to start throwing their coffee, so they tried to shut the doors and get everybody out, but they ended up smashing all the windows in the restaurant, in addition to destroying a lot of the things in there. Before the evening was over, one of the squads outside had all of its windows smashed out, and a newspaper stand was burned to the ground. So the police called for backup. They wanted to arrest the patrons in the restaurant, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. So the drag queens started hitting the cops in the face with their heavy purses and kicking them in the groin. And eventually Compton Cafeteria came out and said, all you are banned from our premises. You are no longer welcome here. And Vanguard, which was one of the first gay youth groups in the U.S., ended up picketing them outside and eventually gave in. And the Compton Cafeteria riots ended when all the windows were smashed out for a second time. The reason why you don't hear about it is even though it was happening in the San Francisco area at the time, which a lot of people think was pretty hip, gay coverage was still pretty low-key, and a lot of newspapers didn't want to pick it up, so it kind of got forgotten to history until somebody was looking through some microfiche, came across the information, and started talking to some of the people that were there that night, and they said, yes, that really did happen. So there's really not any pictures except for this one right here where they're protesting the next day. So Stonewall origins. Before Stonewall, there was just in. It's not like today. Again, like I said, it could ruin your job prospects, go on your police record. End of the 60s, gay sex was still illegal in every single state with the exception of Illinois. Not one federal, state, or local law would protect you from being fired or denied housing. And gays were portrayed as those who preyed on others to recruit into their lifestyle. Stonewall would become that catalyst that would start the modern gay and human rights movement. So here's some pictures of what Stonewall looked like. Stonewall was originally built in the 1800s, and it occupied 51 and 53 Christopher Street, which happened to be two former horse stables in Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village is part of Manhattan, and Manhattan is one of the 5 New York City's boroughs, just to give you some reference points. And if you look, here is the map of where it was. Here's Washington Square Park. The Stonewall Inn is right here. And there's Christopher Park. Some of you have probably heard of that. So in the 1930s, it would become Bonnie's Stonewall Inn, which is the postcard right here. And that was a tea room with a reputation that catered specifically to lesbians. In the by the 40s, it expanded into a full-service restaurant. It was very popular with the locals. The police even ate there. And by the 60s, it would become the Stonewall Inn restaurant until it was gutted by a fire in the late 60s. And then it sat vacant for a time until the mafia came in and became the gay nightclub that you know as the Stonewall Inn. So here's some of the characters in the New York mob at the time. Understand that mob ran gay bars for a very long time. Starting in the 30s, Lucky Luciano, which is this guy, he was the one that ran all gay nightlife in New York City. By the 60s, Tony Loria, known as Fat Tony, unfortunately I could not find a picture of Fat Tony. He was the son of a mafioso, and he opened the Stonewall on March 18th, 1967. To save money on the renovation, because remember it was in a fire, he purposely painted everything black. The ceiling was black, the walls were black, the floors were black. He did that to cover up the burn marks because he was cheap and he didn't want to pay for new furnishings. Then he also reinforced the windows with plywood and 2x4s and painted those black. And then his most expensive addition was he added steel doors to the inside of the front doors. So these were heavy oak doors. He put steel doors in those with slots so that the guard at the door could see who was knocking. He put several locks on that, and all of those were to deter police and slow them down in the event of a raid. So the other thing was some of the other mobsters in this was Ed the Skull Murphy, and he was actually the bouncer on duty that night. He's a former pro wrestler and a closeted gay man that was involved in the mafia, and he was operating that door that night. So you're probably wondering, why exactly did the mafia get into gay nightclubs? Well, it's because there was a vacuum created by the state liquor authority at the time in New York. So essentially, they made serving alcohol to gays illegal. If you were found to be gay and trying to get a drink in one of these places and the bar owner knew that you were gay, he would toss you out on your ear because he did not want to deal with getting in trouble, because what would happen is if the state liquor authority found out you were on the premises, you would get a disorderly conduct as well as the bar. They would shut the bar down, take all the liquor, and you could lose your license. So that created the vacuum for the mafia, because they're not exactly known for following the rules. And they were only too happy to fill that position. Also, according to New York law at the time, anyone wearing less than 3 articles of clothing according to their gender were in violation of subsection 4 of section 240.3 of the New York Penal Code, and were subject to arrest. So I would be subject to arrest. If I was in any of the bars at the time, somebody walked in, the police would collar me, and I would be arrested. The cops did get payoffs from the mafia in order to run their club, so that's how they got around it. In most bars, dancing was not allowed, but this was one of Stonewall's claim to fame. They had not 1, but 2 dance areas. A light would come on in the place if the police entered to allow couples to be aware that they should back away from one another and stop dancing. The Stonewall, and also as a ruse, labeled themselves a bottle club, which at the time was kind of like a members-only institution. So on the bars, they would actually write gibberish like Tom Smith and Dave Jones. These weren't people that were actually in the bar, but they were labeled on their bottles as a bottle club. They also did $1 admission during the weekdays to get into the bar, and it was $3 on the weekend. They kept their money in cigar boxes because one of the first things that they do in a raid is the police would confiscate your cash registers, and they didn't want to lose that. So they were able to easily conceal that in their person and make away with the money. In addition to labeling themselves as a bottle club, they also had a members-only sign-in register, which people wrote things like Donald Duck and, made up names there, because if the cops confiscated that for evidence, if they tried to run any of those names, no one in their right mind would actually use their real name. So it was all a ruse. So that was how they kind of got around some of the liquor laws with the state liquor authority. And then, if you remember, this is 1969, the late 60s, so drinking age at that time was 18. So there was actually a park called Christopher Street Park across the street, which made the Stonewall also unique in the aspect that it was not a bar on a side street. It was right on a main drag. It was across from a large park, and this is where trans people, queens, and homeless gay youth gathered. So they would try to, especially if you were 16, 17, you would go up to the bouncer and try your best to convince him you were of age, and if he believed you, he'd let you in. So they had a lot of underage people in the bar at the time, all the time. It was kind of a rite of passage if you could sneak into the Stonewall. So now when people think of Stonewall, if you've heard of it, I think people have like a rose-colored perception of what the Stonewall was really like. This is a floor plan behind me of what it looked like. The place was actually very dark and dank. Again, everything was painted black. It was kind of depressing. The gross part is it had no running water. So if you're serving drinks to patrons, you're thinking you probably have to wash the dishes, right? Well, if you don't have running water, how do you wash the dishes? The answer simply is you don't. So they would fill tubs, and if I had a beer, and then one of my friends walked up and ordered a beer, they would simply take my glass, run it through the water, rinse it off, throw some beer in there, and serve it to the next person. As you can imagine, that kind of didn't follow health code, and there was a lot of hepatitis outbreaks numerous times there. When they thought the water was dirty, they would sometimes take it to the bathroom and dump it in the toilet, but then that created another problem because the toilets would backflow, and so they become clogged. The bathroom was always wet. It was like a swamp in there. That's what the patrons said at the time. It was really gross. There was also no fire exits, and there was no rear exit. So this place was all kinds of violations. Drugs were easily procured on the inside. You could easily get acid, marijuana, prescription pills. The booze that the mafia was selling their customers was overpriced. It was $1 each. It was watered down, and it was bootlegged, and bootleg means it was stolen. So they were just making profit, money over hand over fist. So you're drinking out of dirty glasses, your beer is stolen, it's getting watered down. They kept some nice bottles at the front counter, so if you thought you were drinking Smirnoff or Grey Goose, no, you weren't. They were putting the cheap stuff in the bottles. They kept unlabeled stuff in the back rooms. Also, if you're dancing, you need music, right? There were jukeboxes in both dance floors. So if you came into the front, so the front dance floor right here, this was primarily the white section. It was kind of segregated in the Stonewall, so this was primarily under 35, mostly white. They listened to music such as the Beach Boys, anything that was mainstream. If you went into the back bar, that's where all the younger people hung out and people of color, and they were listening to soul music, Otis Redding, Aretha Franklin, stuff like that. So it was a little different in each room. 10 cents bought you one song, 25 cents bought you 3 songs. So not only were you paying for your music, and then also if you smoked cigarettes, which a lot of people at that time did, they also owned that too. Fat Tony only put $3,500 into this investment initially when he started it up. He made all of his money back the first weekend it was open. And so you wonder why, if I'm describing the situation with the bar being as gross as it was, why did people put up with this? It's simply because gays had nowhere to go at the time. If you were straight, you could get a hotel room. You could sit in the park and not get harassed. Cops were harassing people in the bathrooms, bathhouses, parks, anywhere that they congregated. They'd raid your bar, so there wasn't a lot of places to go, and that the place was semi-private. And it was one of the places that you could actually talk to a person and sex wasn't involved. It was kind of popular because one of the other options was, especially with young men, would go down to the docks, and that's usually where they would hook up, and that place was raided a lot. There were meat trucks that were used for meat during the day, and at night they were used for other things. Mayor John Lindsay, so he was mayor at the time, and he was up for re-election in November of 1969. He wanted to clean up the city so that he could tell his citizens that he had some data to provide them what he was doing and why he was so awesome and why you should re-elect him. And so he talked to the cops and he said, I want you to crack down on some of these groups, and among one of the groups was the gays. And so they became a targeted population, so they started raiding those trucks, the bathhouses, the parks, and the bars. The numbers started going way up. The first targets were the trucks on the docks, and the first gay bar that was actually raided was called the Checkerboard, and that was 1 week before Stonewall. So there were other gay bars to go to. And then this picture is actually the docks that I was talking about. So the raid. On Tuesday, June 24th, 1969, the Stonewall was raided by Detective Seymour Pine. The bar owner yelled after Pine, if you want to make a bust, that's your business, but just know we'll be open again tomorrow. And that kind of rubbed Pine the wrong way. He went and got a warrant, and he decided that he was going to come back and he was going to shut down the Stonewall for good. He also enlisted help of 6 other cops, mostly undercover, to help with the raid, including Detective Charles Smythe. Stonewall became kind of known as the gay shot heard around the world. There's many stories that come from Stonewall. One of the famous stories is cobblestones and bricks being ripped out of the streets. Another one was an angry drag queen picked up a shot glass and said, I have my civil rights, and she threw a shot glass at the bar mirror and shattered it. So a lot of people will call it the gay shot heard around the world. So on the night of Stonewall, 2 female cops that were undercover went into the bar to scope it out. They were trying to get some intel so that when they did arrests, it would stick and they would be able to shut the bar down. And the sign was they were supposed to come out and tell Detective Pine just by walking out of the bar that, like, okay, it's good to go, let's raid it. But they weren't coming out in the time frame that he had originally given them. He got nervous. And so he said, oh my God, something happened to them. So he went into the bar, and he walked up to the front door, and he said, police, we're taking the place. And that was At 1:28 a.m., the music was cranked and couples were out on the dance floor. The lights went out, the music stopped. People were super confused, they didn't know what was going on. The cops went right to the back room, they started shoving everyone to the front. People started panicking because remember, they don't want to be found in the bar. They have a lot to lose, jobs, housing. Cops sealed the doors right away, said no one can leave unless you have an ID. Not everybody had an ID in them, so they're scrambling, looking for Bloomingdale credit cards and stuff to give their buddies so they can get out. The police called for backup and barked at the patrons to get in line so they could get processed. And the patrons at the time, they didn't know, are we going to get arrested? Are you going to let us go? We don't know. They took the bar workers to the bathroom to start questioning them. And this picture is some of the jukeboxes and things, the cigarette machine and all that got smashed. So the people inside were getting really, really agitated. And the cops started ripping the benches off the walls, breaking them apart. The jukeboxes were smashed. Pine gave an order to cut up the bars. He was serious. He did not want the Stonewall to exist in any capacity any longer. The gays started talking back to the cops, and it was primarily the drag queens at the time, and they said, we're not taking this, I'm not giving you my ID. And the cops were getting irritated because they were getting talked back to, and they just reminded them, no one's leaving here unless you give us an ID. And the trans women refused to go to the bathroom. They told them to go fly a kite. Because remember, they have to check them for the 3 pieces of clothing. And so they refused to go in the bathroom to be checked by the female officers to determine what their gender was. So 15 minutes later, the cops take all the trans women that were giving them a hard time, they take them outside to the waiting paddy wagons. And there's some lesbians in the bar at the time too, and they're yelling, we have the right to be here. You know, what are you doing? And as people are being processed, they're being sent outside. And normally, when you were arrested in a gay bar, you would slink off into the night because you were ashamed. You didn't want to be caught. People would try to take pictures of you. Your name would end up in the paper the next day. Your employer would find out. And they didn't do that night. As they were letting them out into the street, they just kept gathering. And so then all of a sudden, the cops look out the door, and the 150 to 200 people are slowly ending up out in the street, and they're standing there. It's kind of starting to freak them out because they're like, why are these gay people standing there? Why aren't they leaving? And so they knew they were outnumbered, so they were getting kind of antsy. So Pine gets on the CB radio, and he calls for extra help. And it keeps getting disregarded. And later they said they think somebody was on the CB channel, because every time he would call out for help, there would be somebody that said, disregard. Thank you. Disregard. And so gays started calling friends on payphones. At this time, there were no cell phones. There was no internet. So like, to get people to know anything, you called them on the phone or you started yelling down the street, and that's just what they did. They started running around. They said, you know, the cops are busting the Stonewall, get down here. So people started gathering from other places that weren't in the bar. And with each passing minute, the crowd is getting angrier because they're slow in their process because the cops aren't letting the ones that don't have the IDs outside. And so they thought that the cops were beating on them. And so somebody starts throwing pennies. And they're like, here you go, copper. Like, take this copper, you know, copper pennies. That's where they got that from. And they start throwing that at the building. The cops are getting pelted as they're trying to load these people into the paddy wagons. And then somebody throws a full beer can at one of the cop cars. And Maria Richter is out celebrating her 18th birthday that night, and she was a trans woman. And she was really excited. She had been sneaking into the bar this entire time. And she gets into the bar, and then that's when this raid happens. She pleads with the officer as she's being loaded into the paddy wagon, please don't arrest me. It's my 18th birthday, and I'm wearing my mother's dress. She's going to kill me. And the cop was a younger cop, and he said, just go. And he looked the other way, and she ran off into the night. And so people start beating on the cop car, and someone throws a brick because they're trying to load a lesbian at the time into one of the squads. And she's giving him what for. She fought him all the way to from the Stonewall entrance all the way into the police car. They got her in the car not one, not two, but 3 times. Each time she got back to the Stonewall entrance. Eventually, 4 cops jump on her to get her in there. And she's yelling and hollering. And she's like, I'm not going. And she yells to the crowd, "Why don't you do something?" And that was kind of the catalyst of why the crowd lost it. They got really angry. And so they started rocking the wagons. They were rocking the cop cars. Pine freaked out. He's like, "Get the squads out of here. Get them down to the 6th precinct." Somebody throws a brick. It lands with a thud on the trunk of the car. So they take off, but before the squad gets moving, guys take out their pocket knives and they slash all 4 tires of the squad before it gets out. It does escape, but with flat tires. So Craig Rodwell was kind of instrumental that night. He was a guy that was living in the area, and he was coming home with his lover at the time, and he saw this activity going on at the Stonewall. And he was kind of one of those guys that was hoping that things were going to happen. He was like, "Oh my God, it's finally happening. Like, gays have had enough." And so he gets on the phone, his boyfriend gets on the phone, and they call all the newspapers. And they're like, "Come down here, there's some stuff going on." So this is a major difference of why the Stonewall is why we know it and not the Compton cafeteria, because he got press coverage. And so they all came down and started snapping pictures, and that's where a lot of these pictures come from that night, was from like the New York Times and stuff like that. So he sees that the cops are getting a hard time and they're getting nervous, so he yells off his porch, "Gay power." And at first people start laughing at him because like gays never did anything like this before, but then they start chanting it. And there were tree pits in the street that had cobblestone lined in it, and according to lore, there was a construction site somewhere around there that these people were getting bricks from, and they started throwing them at the building. So the cops got out of there pretty fast because they didn't want to get hit with a brick. And they were ordered inside by Pine, and at that point, the crowd was like, "Let's get them." And it's kind of funny looking back that like this group of people that were picked on all the time by the police, we're getting them to be on the run, because mostly the cops were getting this from drag queens and homeless youth, and they thought that was the weakest of the weak of the gay contingency, so they were a little surprised when drag queens were giving them a what's for. So the 2nd floor window ends up smashed. At this time, there's about 500 to 600 people outside. The homeless gay youth across the street were seen filling Coke bottles with some kind of liquid. It turned out they were making Molotov cocktails. They started throwing that at the building, and 4 gay men picked up a parking meter and ripped it out of the sidewalk and started using it as an improvised battering ram. And they start beating the hell out of this front door, and it eventually gives. And the cops are scrambling to get the door shut, and meanwhile these bottles are flying in. Somebody grabs a hose and they're trying to put out the fires and stomp it out, but the building's on fire because other people are sticking pieces of paper under the plywood windows outside and using their lighters to light the windows on fire. Somebody throws a garbage can on fire through one of the windows that they've now broken out with the improvised battering ram. So the place is on fire. The cops are now really, really nervous on the inside. They're reaching for their guns. Pine's getting nervous. He's like, "There is no need for somebody to lose their life over this. I just came in to shut a bar down. No one needs to get shot." And so he goes up to each officer one by one and says, "If you unholster your gun and fire without my permission, you will be working the worst beat for the rest of your life if I allow you to stay as a police officer." So he addresses each person by name to kind of like get their attention. So they are trying to figure out ways to get out. Remember, there's no fire exits, there's no rear exit. Eventually, they're able to squeeze the female officers through a venting shaft, and they're able to run for help to the fire department. So then they start hearing the fire department's sirens coming down the street, and they know that help's on the way. So the firefighters arrive with the Tactical Police Force, also known as the TPF, and they are the riot police. And they come in, and they have helmets and shields and billy clubs and protective gear on their bodies, and they're wearing all this stuff, and they're fighting people that are like literally out there dancing. They had no weapons. They had rocks and some stones and maybe the occasional brick. They had nothing. So it's kind of weird seeing this dichotomy of all these heavily armored people going against just everyday citizens. So when the TPF gets there, they start getting heckled by the gay street youth, and they start calling them Lily Law and Girls in Blue, and they spend the next several hours chasing them through the streets. And they were forming rocket lines and kicking up their legs before they would run away. And they were saying, "We are the Stonewall girls. We wear our hair in curls. We wear our dungarees above our Nelly knees." And there was another more R-rated version that they also said. And Craig Rodwell at this point had started running through the streets yelling "Gay Power," and stuff was kind of going on until about 2 a.m. But even until 4 in the morning, there was people standing out on the street saying, like, "Whoa, like, what just happened?" So day 2, it's now June 29th, 1969, it's Saturday. Word spreads throughout the day that, like, the gays had had enough, and they stood up, and people were like, "Whoa, there's something going on. I want to be a part of this." So people start coming down to Greenwich Village to see the Stonewall and see, like, what they all did. And there's messages written on the walls outside, such as "Legalize gay bars," "Support gay power." The news of the riot had spread. And so by 9 o'clock, there was an angry crowd. It was chanting. They call in the TPF again. But the cops are still way outnumbered by gays and lesbians mostly. And by midnight, there's almost 2,000 people gathered. And the crowd consisted by that time of hippies, gays, heterosexuals, tourists, and villagers that were yelling and chanting the Stonewall song. So gays were camping it up and kissing in front of one another and posing for pictures. The mood was still very angry, but people were just tired of hiding. Saturday, June 28th, 2019 was the hottest day in New York City history. The crowds continued to grow and spill into the streets. They blocked Christopher Street, and people started forming human chains across the roadways. And so they were blocking cars and buses from going through, and the cops were constantly fighting with them to, like, stop impeding traffic. And one hapless New York cabbie unfortunately turned down Christopher Street and was met by an angry mob, and they're rocking the car and pounding on the hood. And the 2 people that were in there were, like, freaking out, and so was the driver. And the driver unfortunately started having a heart attack, and so they let him back out. But unfortunately, he passed. He is the only known fatality from the Stonewall Riots. So they started throwing garbage can lids, like if you picture discus throwers. They were throwing garbage can lids, and they were bouncing off of the riot police's helmets. And fires were being set in trash cans again. And also, sparks were falling high from windows down the street from the House of Detention, which was New York City's women's prison. Many of them were people of color who happened to identify as lesbians, and they were throwing their toilet paper lit on fire to show solidarity with the rioters outside that they wish they could join in with. Marsha P. Johnson was a famous drag queen who frequented the Stonewall. And she was there that second night. She climbed on top of a lamppost and from a very high height dropped a heavy object. Don't know what the heavy object was, but it smashed out the front window of the cruiser. And cops got antsy. They all jumped in the squad, not before grabbing some hapless guy that just happened to be there. He had nothing to do with it. They grabbed him in the car and they started beating the pulp out of him in the squad as they drove away. And then another group attacked an additional cop car and threw a concrete block on the hood while the others were beating the car with their fists and shaking it. And that squad, while it was driving through, because a lot of cars didn't have air conditioning back then, so they drove with the windows down. One of the sergeants who was on duty had the misfortune of a full can of garbage being thrown through the window where it broke open in front of his face. So he had coffee filters and God knows what dripping down his face. That night, 150 tactical police force officers arrived to quell the crowds, and they got to contend with beer cans being thrown at them all night. So on day 3 through 6, because if you didn't know, the Stonewall Riots were June 28th through July 3rd. Groups of gay men and women were walking around Christopher Street handing out flyers, headline, "Get the Mafia and the Cops Out of the Gay Bars." Craig Rodwell authored that. And he wrote that pamphlet and proclaimed that the night of Friday, June 27th and Saturday, June 28th would go down in history. The protesters turned up Sunday, but there was work the next day, so the numbers weren't quite there. Sunday, June 30th, the Mattachine Society asked people to be peaceful, and they wrote this message on the wall. They said, "We homosexuals plead with our people to please help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of the village." And the cops were only too happy to accept that help. The crowd reached about 1,000 people on Sunday. At some point, as they counted everybody throughout the day, the tempers were flaring because the cops were just irritated at that point because they were honestly embarrassed that they had been taken to task by a group of gay people. And the beatings kept commencing throughout the day because the cops were baiting the gays were baiting the cops, but unfortunately the cops were beating their heads in with billy clubs. So you saw a lot of people nursing head wounds and bleeding in the streets, and the riots lasted about 2 hours. On Wednesday, July 2nd, or July 3rd, I'm sorry, is also known as the last official day of the riots. Kind of like when you're at a campfire and your campfire starts dying down, but if you give it a little more fuel, it pops right back up. Well, that's what happened with this. Unfortunately, the Village Voice published some very unfavorable articles, and they wrote some phrases in there that was describing the rioters as limp-wristed. All the while, they were reassuring their readership, "We're two straight men writing this article. We want you to know we're straight." And they were just picking on the gay people that were there. And the gays honestly got sick of it. They said, "We're sick of this paper that tells everybody that they're so open-minded when actually they're very homophobic." And so people made plans to actually burn the newspaper building to the ground, but that was later aborted. And so the riots flared up again that night. They only lasted about an hour. Garbage cans were set on fire. That's when the gangs were showing up from as far away as New Jersey. Black Panthers, hippies, yippies, people that were just itching for any revolution, even if it wasn't theirs. Cops were begging people, "Please go back into the Stonewall." Stonewall was begging people to please come in, but they couldn't serve alcohol because the cops were there, so they were giving away free soda. And the crowds numbered around 500. 5 arrests were made on that last day, and they were charged with harassment. So that's a picture of the Village Voice and the article that angered everybody. And then this was an article that was ran a couple of days later. But this was the kind of stuff that you'd seen in newspapers at the time. Homo nest rated, queen bees are stinging mad, because that's just how they talked about gay people. You wouldn't really see that a lot today. But this was an article written at the end of the week. So note the language used in the headlines. Some people debate about the accuracy of what actually happened at the Stonewall riots. And honestly, Stonewall was a messy business. LGBTQ plus history is a messy business, and I say that because people that belong to this group have lived in the shadows for so long. So really, this is just about reclaiming narratives. And honestly, it doesn't matter who threw the first shot glass or brick or stone. It matters that it happened, and it matters that it's acknowledged and remembered. So that concludes the Stonewall Riots presentation and leaves me a couple of minutes to answer any questions that you may have. Yay, I made it. So does anyone have any questions?
I know there's a plaque there, but Stonewall didn't anymore, does it?
The original building doesn't. It's more of a tourist trap from what I understand now. It is on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places, and it's also a historical landmark. And if you don't know this, it actually became a U.S. National Monument in 2016, which makes it the only LGBTQ national monument in our country. So that's kind of cool. Yes, Grant.
Did the mayor get reelected?
You know, I actually don't remember what happened to John Lindsay. I think he did. I think he was still in office in the 70s. I have some handouts. So, I mean, when I was talking to my boss, Joni, she's like, you know, you get really passionate about these things and you take like the 5,000 foot approach. I'm just a nerd. I like facts and I really like history. So if your minds are still spinning or I stuffed it full of facts and you're like, I'm good, great, great.